Right. Last time we did the 18th century and we continued into the beginning of the 19th century with Napoleon and all that stuff. And what we saw with the death of King William IV was the end of the Hanoverian dynasty and the beginning of the Victorian period. Queen Victoria was so powerful and so much of an important presence in the life of the 19th century that we refer to everybody who lived in Britain in that time as the Victorians. And Victorian is the adjective for everything: Victorian literature, Victorian architecture, Victorian music, Victorian life, etc. Victoria was the granddaughter of old George III. So she became queen after the death of her two uncles, uh, George IV and William the Fourth. Her father had already died. His name was Edward, Duke of Kent. Um, and so she became the queen. Um, she was German in origin. She was of German background, but so were the others. But her mother was from Germany, and she spoke German as a native tongue and English as a second language. Um, she went on to marry a German prince called Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and with him she had more than 10 children. And she is often called the grandmother of Europe because many of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren were kings and queens and princes and princesses of many different countries in Europe. Um, so apart from shagging, what did she do and what was important or interesting about her? Well, 19th century was a very important one for Britain, and it's one of the more modern, more recent, well, it's the most recent one that we've covered so far. Um, so Britain was extremely powerful in the 19th century. It had defeated Napoleon, and the defeat of Napoleon had kept the French down and boosted the British up into being basically the world's superpower and the most powerful nation in the world. America would later replace Britain as the world superpower, but this didn't happen for another 100 years. Um, Victoria is considered to have been very conservative socially in her ideas and quite strict regarding family and things like that. Um, she's not considered as being a fun person. She's considered as having been quite a dull, boring person, like a strict school teacher type, and not very pleasant. And now she didn't have a lot of power because this progress of parliamentarianism continued and got stronger. Um, so remember, we had the Whigs and the Tories. Well, we still had Whigs and Tories when Elizabeth came into power, and she usually had prime ministers that she liked and prime ministers that she didn't like. Her favourite prime minister was a man called Lord Melbourne, and Lord Melbourne was a Whig, but really it didn't have much to do with the ideologies of the prime ministers. It was more to do with the personalities of them, and she liked him. But as we continue, we will get to some of the more important politicians of the Victorian era and some of the big political changes that took place. So we had the Industrial Revolution. So Britain is now an extremely advanced technological and industrial power with a very, very strong military, a huge empire, and the control of all of the oceans and seas in the world. It has added Australia and New Zealand to its empire. It has colonized India. It has established colonies in East Asia. Even though it has lost the 13 colonies of North America, it still has Canada in its empire. And during the 19th century, Britain expands its empire even further to include quite a large part of Africa, indeed almost half of the continent of Africa. So it's an absolutely enormous empire. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, we have the French Revolution and all the stuff with Napoleon. And these ideas about rebellion and revolution and ideas about political equality and freedom are spreading. And at the same time, Britain has an enormous population. It has more people living in cities as well. And literacy begins to grow, which means people can read and write but more than used to. And they're reading and writing about revolution and change. Now, Britain has a parliament, and the parliamentarians, or the members of parliament, are people with money and people who control land and can tell people who to vote for. Most people can't vote. You have to have money and property to be allowed to vote. People who have more power and more property and more money can control people with less money and less property. So the whole system is very corrupt and very unfair, and it certainly isn't a real democracy. There are two parties there are two big parties. There's the Whigs and the Tories. But this changes a little bit. Now, the political ideas, or the area of political ideas, expands further. So you had a system where there were conservatives and people who wanted a strong state and a strong monarchy and a strong religion on the one hand, opposed by people who wanted a stronger parliament and more religious freedom and more intellectual freedom on the other hand. Now, that group, which was the Whigs, became the Liberals, and the ideas that they had were about freedom most of all, and political freedom and freedom of speech and so on, social freedom. And the Conservatives were the ones who took over from the Tories and emphasised a strong state and strong traditional institutions, and not changing things and not rebelling against things and not destroying things and bringing things down. So the that was the fucking two sides. But a third side sort of came into existence in the second and third decades of the 19th century, and that is socialism and the idea of political equality and economic and social equality, not just concerned over political representation and intellectual freedom, but also in a redistribution of power and wealth. So there were socialists, there were communists, and other groups, and workers, people who did normal jobs, working with their hands in factories and stuff, were basically in a very poor condition usually, and they lived in shit houses, and they didn't have enough fucking food to eat, and they didn't have enough clothes to wear, and their children were fucking starving and dying in the streets, and they were treated like shit, and the people who owned the businesses were making fuckloads of money. And some people thought this wasn't fair. And this was also mixed with the fact that there was no democracy and you couldn't vote unless you were some wealthy cunt. Um, and these ideas spread across Europe and had some influence in Britain as well, but not as much as the liberal ideas and the Whig ideas. Um, People in the Whigs who were more extreme in their views wanted to have democracy or republic or wanted to have a revolution. Some of them also agreed with these socialist ideas as well. Some of them didn't. But the people who were the more extreme and wanted the most change, they were called the radicals. And the radicals were more revolutionary than the classical Whigs. Um, and some people who were in the Whigs looked at the socialism and they looked at the radicals and they thought, oh, we don't like that so much. So what happened was that the radicals joined with some of the Whigs and they became the Liberals, and the Tories joined with some of the Whigs and they became the Conservatives. And the Conservatives were a little bit more pro-parliamentarian than the Tories had been, and the Whigs were a little bit more interested in money and economics, not just religion and stuff, than the Whigs had been. So there's a lot of civil social unrest in Britain. There's riots taking place, there are demonstrations, there are people protesting against the government. There is also the start of trade unions. This is people who have jobs, workers organising to try to have some power and influence over how much they get paid and what kind of working conditions they live in or they work in. And all this, but most of it doesn't really have any success because the governments and the armies just tell them to fuck off or tell them to shut the fuck up, or send them to prison or send them to Australia or whatever. And the other countries in Europe have revolutions, but Britain doesn't because they're a bit harder on the people. And fucking anyway, there's even more industrial change and more technological improvements, and the railways are a big thing, and the fucking underground railways built in the 1860s. Fucking hell. And the British are really good at industry and technology and stuff. And the big cities continue to grow even bigger. And this improvement and this growth in technology and in industry and in populations also leads to increases in social problems and in social unrest and rebellion and revolt, and the organisation of movements to try to change the political system and the social systems in England to make them a bit more fair and a bit easier for people to live in. And they begin to challenge the old rulers. So in the 1830s, there's a Reform Act, and this is a change in the politics which increases the amount of people who can vote in elections. And then there are several other acts that continue throughout the 19th century, and gradually more and more people get to be allowed to vote. But it's not until after the First World War in the 20th century that this really includes all adults. Um, there's a group of people called the Chartists who in the 1830s and 1840s challenged the monarchy, and they want to create a democracy where everybody gets to vote and we don't have any lords. But that doesn't get any success, and they fail. There's also a group called the Free Trade Movement, and the Free Trade people want the British government to stop taxing people for importing and exporting goods, and they want it to be easier for business people to do business anywhere in the world without having to pay loads of taxes to the government, and they have more success. Karl Marx lives in London. He's from Germany, and he's the guy that comes up with fucking communism as an idea, basically. Well, doesn't come up with the idea, but he fucking bigs it up and says it's a good idea, and it becomes really influential in the 20th century. In terms of wars, now in the 19th century, once Napoleon is finished, Britain doesn't have a lot of big wars against big powerful rivals. It has lots and lots of wars, little wars against colonial, against people who aren't as big and powerful as the British. There's only one war with a big powerful country that Britain has, and that's in the 1850s, and that's the Crimean War, when they have a war against Russia. And that war kind of ends sort of 50-50, really. Nobody really gets much out of that. Loads of people get killed. But there are loads of wars all over the fucking world. In Afghanistan, in India, in the Sudan, in Egypt. There's all kinds of little wars and little fights, but usually it's the British with all their guns and stuff fighting against people who don't have guns and aren't as big or powerful and can quite easily be destroyed. At the end of the 19th century, Britain has a war against, or two wars against these people called the Boer, who are white Dutch descended people in South Africa. And they do quite well against the British, and the British get a bit fucked, but win in the end. You might have seen the film Zulu, which is about the Zulu Wars, when the British got fucking wiped out by people with spears. But mostly Britain was at peace, mostly, and they call it the Pax Britannica, which is Latin for the British peace. Now, two very important politicians came about in the second half of the 19th century. One of them was called William Gladstone, and the other one was called Benjamin Disraeli. And Gladstone was a liberal, and Disraeli was a conservative. And they were both prime minister many, many, many times. And really, because they changed their ideas so much, they ended up almost with there not being much big difference between the conservatives and the liberals by the end of the 19th century. They were quite similar. They all believed in big business. They all believed in religious freedom. They all believed in having some democracy, but not too much. And they all believed that having a king was good, and there wasn't a lot of really big difference between them at that stage, because they were trying, as democracy increased and more people could vote, then the Conservatives would try to copy it would try to copy the popular ideas that Liberals had to get people to vote for them, and the Liberals would copy ideas that Conservatives had to try to win people for them. And the Conservatives actually made quite a lot of big changes in government to increase democracy, as well as the Liberals. And the Liberals did a lot of things in the government that you might think were quite conservative. So it's quite difficult to comment on how radically different they were from each other. They had been more different from each other previously, when they'd been Tories and Whigs, than they were when they were Liberals and Conservatives in the second half of the 19th century. When we get to the 20th century, the Liberals change again and the Conservatives change again, and they become a little bit different. And then we get the Socialists. They come into the picture. But during the 19th century, socialism is a radical idea that isn't represented in Parliament or in politics in Britain. People in Britain, a lot of them are fucking poor and don't have fuck all money or shoes on their feet. Health is fucking terrible. People have all sorts of fucking diseases and are dropping dead like fucking flies. Some places are just shitholes. In 1888, there's Jack the Ripper, who's the famous serial killer who's fucking butchering women in East End of London, and this really shows how fucking unfair society is, because you could get a prostitute for less than what it costs for a cup of tea. And people were being shat on. So there were some developments that were positive and some that were negative. You know, I mean, you might say that imperialism is bad, or you might say that it's good, but that increased in the 19th century. So it depends what your opinion is about that. There was more peace. I guess you could say that was good, but then they were still fighting people like the Zulus and Afghanistan and whatnot. Now there was more democracy that increased, so that was good, you could say. Although there wasn't much difference between the two political parties, so it didn't really matter that much, and it wasn't full democracy, so it depends what you think. Queen Victoria didn't personally do very much. She was more of a figurehead and more of a representation of the state. Quite similar to how Queen Elizabeth is now, although Queen Victoria did sometimes try to change things that she didn't like them, or say things about things that she didn't like. Really, what happened under the Victorian times was that things became quite simple in a way. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about now. Fuck it, no. Anyway, let's go back to fucking talking about Victoria herself. And she had more than 10 children, and she married them all to various German princes and Russian princes and different princes and princesses across Europe. And when she died, her son became king, and her grandson after that, and she had another grandson who was the German Kaiser, and another granddaughter who was the Empress of Russia, and she had relatives all over Europe. In many of these relatives would be killed in the revolutions that were to take place in the 20th century. Also, during the 19th century, the Americans had their Civil War, and the American Civil War led to huge changes in military technology. It led to the development of metal battleships and submarines and machine guns and revolvers, and this really changed the military and the way things were done in war. Because in Victoria's time, you had men in red uniforms lining up close together and trying to shoot at people with very inaccurate guns, and you had men riding on horses with swords, and you had wooden ships firing cannon at each other in the sea. And 15 years after Victoria's death, you would have barbed wire, machine guns, poison gas, aeroplanes dropping bombs, and submarines firing torpedoes. The developments that lead to the enormous changes in war had started during the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, the British Army stops wearing the red uniforms and starts wearing camouflage, and it's called khaki. The colour that they wear is called khaki, which is an Indian word, which means coloured dust. Yeah, so this lecture is a bit shit. I might not publish this actually because it's a bit shit. It's not my favourite period actually. It's probably my least favourite. You probably find my least favourite fucking period of British history actually, the Victorian times. I don't really give a fuck about it really. I think it's all a bit shit. The only thing I really like is Jack the Ripper. Yeah, I might delete this, but I might just put it up anyway. And if you think it's shit, you can say that it's shit in the comments, and I'll just fucking delete it. I can. Right, so that's the fucking Victorians. And sorry, it's a bit of a shitter.